practice. I have a clip-on mic, so I feel a little bit like a talk show host, and hopefully you can hear me and I'm clear. So again, for those of you who don't know, my name is Allison Hicks, and I work in the social science division, and I teach sociology and criminal justice classes. And today I'm talking about some research that I did for my dissertation, Negotiating Emotions, Prison Chaplains as a Case Study. So I spent 5 years with prison chaplains studying what it is that they did. And this is just one little tiny piece of that larger project. So I'm hoping that it will be clear. And if it's not, of course, ask questions along the way. The reason I think this topic is so important to talk about has to do with the tendency that we see with incarceration to dehumanize the individuals who are held behind their walls, both in terms of the inmates and the staff. And religion has been argued to counteract this tendency. So you can see Justice William J. Brennan, this is 1987, claiming that incarceration by its very nature is denying a prisoner participation in the larger human community, but denying the opportunity to affirm membership in a spiritual community, this is the role of religion obviously, however, may extinguish their last source of hope for dignity and redemption. So the research that we have, what little we have, shows that involvement in religious activity can be beneficial to inmates for several different reasons. First, that it helps with dealing with issues of depression. It helps inmates cope with issues of frustration and survival challenges. We find that those who are actively involved in religious programming tend to cope best with what we call pains of imprisonment. And these are the deprivations associated with being incarcerated, which I'll talk about in a moment. And when we ask inmates, we specifically say to those inmates who have left prison and who are doing well, they haven't reoffended, they haven't recommitted a crime, and they haven't come back to prison, they will say that prison chaplains, religious volunteers, actively participating in religious programs helped me to be successful when I left here. So that's a pretty big endorsement. Both the empirical data are saying it's a good thing, and inmates themselves are also saying it's very, very helpful to them when they leave the prison. So today, I'll be talking specifically about prison chaplains. I'm first going to tell you a little about who are prison chaplains. That's where I'm going to start. Next, I will talk a little bit about how chaplains see emotions in the prison setting and some of the problems that they identify with emotions in the prison setting, because let's face it, we all have feelings, we all have emotions. How might those things be problematic when we have those emotions in a total institution? Last but not least, I hope to talk a little bit briefly about how chaplains are trying to alleviate some of these problems that we see with emotions in the correctional setting. So, to start, who are chaplains? Who are prison chaplains? Who are we actually talking about? Well, prison chaplains are men and women who are members of religious organizations, different faith backgrounds, who are employed either at the state or the federal level. At the state level, they would be employed by the Department of Corrections. At the federal level, they'll be employed by the Federal Bureau of Prisons, or the FBOP as we might call them. And their main role as employees is to serve the variety of religious needs of incarcerated persons. There is a variety of religious backgrounds in prison, and the chaplain's role is to try and meet all of those needs, all of those variety of needs. Now, I'm not talking about religious volunteers, although there are many, many, many people who volunteer their time in the prison to provide religious programming for inmates, but they are not paid, so they are not employees. So that's one distinction to make, and it's a big distinction. The second distinction is that some chaplains are employed by one institution or one facility, and so they are permanent employees of the maximum security facility in New York State, and others are considered to be contract chaplains, which means that they're more of a part-time, they're more temporary, they're still an employee of that facility, but they're hired on an as-needed basis. because of the diversity and variety of faith backgrounds in prisons, sometimes the facility has to hire out for someone to come in and meet a specific religious need. For example, maybe it's a Buddhist need, so we'll hire a Buddhist contract chaplain to come and fill that need. So that's an important distinction also to make. There are volunteers, there are full-time chaplains, and then there are part-time contract chaplains who travel around to different facilities meeting the needs as the facility sees fit. Chaplains today are highly educated. Almost 80% of them have a master's or greater, and almost the vast majority of them have clinical pastoral education, or CPE training, which is a theologically oriented counseling training for chaplains in institutions. Because again, as I said, there's a variety of religious and faith needs behind bars, but the overwhelming amount of chaplains self-identify as Christian. Let's see here, 69.4% self-identify as Protestant, just under 26% self-identify as Catholic. So we are asking them to serve a variety of needs, okay, all inmates' religious needs, even those that don't fall in their own faith background. So they do need additional training. These aren't people just coming in from the community. Okay, so prison chaplains, that's a little bit about who they are today, but they have been active in prison programming since 1820, when we first saw the rise of penitentiaries in Pennsylvania and New York. And at that time, in 1820, they had a lot of power, they had a lot of authority. Their main purpose was to help offenders repent, to save their souls, to save those sinners. So they had a very narrow focus, but they exerted a lot of power. And today we see almost the complete opposite. As time has gone by and their role has been transformed, correctional budgets have shrank, prison populations have exploded, the role of the prison chaplain has broadened. We ask them to do lots and lots of things, but their power, their authority has diminished at the same time. So in 1997, when we asked prison chaplains, what is it that you do, they identified 5 broad categories of things that they were being asked to do. The first is administrative. The second are services to inmates. These are things like making sure that their letters are getting out to family members, making sure that they have rosary beads or a Bible. They're also asked to participate in religious activities, assistance to correctional staff, which is one we might not think of as an obvious one, and then community relationships. They're being asked to do these 5 broad, large-scale activities. But even within those things, they're being asked to do lots and lots of activities like funeral and marriage services, death notifications. A death notification occurs when an inmate's family member might die and somebody has to let that individual know. And it's probably one of the most despised jobs in the prison to go to an inmate and tell them that their child has died or their spouse has died. So the chaplain often is given this duty, and actually, when asked, they seem to like it. It gives them a very special niche in which they can establish their identity, like, this is what I do, this is who I am. Chaplains will also help inmates establish plans for release and also help them adjust to coming into the prison, because a lot of these inmates might be their first time, or it might be their first time in this facility. So chaplains are there to help them have a smooth transition, whether it's into the prison or out of the prison. And so I'm hoping that you get the sense that in 1820, their primary purpose was to help offenders repent, to save their souls, to save the sinners. And today we're asking them to do much more administrative types of work. It's a lot less about doing religion than managing religion. And that's a key component. So that's a little bit about who chaplains are and what they do. And before we go any further, I want to make one small distinction, that chaplains are identified as treatment staff and not custodial staff. Treatment staff are the rehabilitative. We want to change the inmate. We want to make them better. We want to help them, when they are released, to not reoffend, to be law-abiding. They're not considered custodial staff because custodial staff are all about managing the inmates, so making sure that this group of inmates abides by the rules, doesn't do something bad, I'm going to write you up. that is the custodial staff. And chaplains are not considered to be custodial staff, although hopefully through this talk I can convince you they still are controlling inmates and still performing custodial functions. Okay, what do we expect from imprisonment? Well, we certainly don't expect it to be a resort. We don't expect it to be fun. In fact, it's supposed to hurt a little bit because it's punishment. And we identify these pains of imprisonment that inmates go through as part of being incarcerated. Pains of imprisonment, the bad part about being in prison. So inmates are deprived of their liberty, they're cut off from their friends and family, they're isolated from the rest of the community, they're deprived of goods and services, they're deprived of heterosexual relationships. Obviously, we don't house men and women together traditionally, though sometimes this does happen. But for the most part, we're depriving them of these heterosexual relationships from their spouses or significant others. They're deprived of their personal autonomy. You don't get to make decisions when you're incarcerated. Somebody makes those decisions for you, and you have to adhere to those decisions. You have no autonomy. Last but not least, something that perhaps we don't mean to have happen, but is a latent function of being incarcerated, is the idea that you're deprived of security, that these are not considered to be safe places. They are not considered to be safe places. So the pains of imprisonment are colloquially called the do-withouts, and they're painful and contribute to what Curley and Copes have called the miasma of prison. The miasma of the prison is the feeling that when you go into the prison, it actually feels different. The atmosphere can actually weigh on you. The sense of foreboding and uncertainty and anxiety of going into the prison. Okay? And I've taken students on field trips to prisons before, and even they will say that they can experience this sort of environment where the air feels different, your anxiety is higher, your heart beats a little bit because you're a little bit stressed. Hearing those doors clang behind you does something to you. You feel different in this space that is prison than when you walk out those doors. And that is called the miasma of prison. Now, the miasma of prison is expected to contribute to feelings, okay, negative emotions, the feeling of anxiety, the feeling of fear. So just think about it for a second. Visualize what it would be like to go into that prison as an inmate and what that might feel like. Visualize coming in. Here we have a sally port. Sally port are two gates right here. Coming in, hearing that clanging behind you, knowing that you're going to be separated from your friends and family, coming into this 7 by 11 foot cell that you're going to share with at least one other stranger who you know nothing about other than the fact that they've been convicted of a felony. Perhaps it's violent, perhaps it's not violent, but that's pretty much all you know. And unlike being in a roommate situation here at Alfred, you're not being not given the opportunity to ask to be moved, to be reassigned, that what you get is what you get, and not knowing if you make that person mad, what are they going to do to you? Are they going to harm you? And the anxiety that might result. Add to that the fact that, obviously, you have no autonomy. Your decisions are structured for you. You don't get to decide when will you shower, how long will your shower be, what kind of shampoo can you use, can I get some new socks? None of those decisions are up to you. They're up to somebody else. And then the feeling that you have to obey various rules, some of which you might not know at the beginning. How many photos can I post on my wall? How many compact discs might I be able to have? May I have compact discs? And how these rules can change depending on what correctional officer you're talking to, depending on what facility you're in, and whether somebody's having a good mood or a bad mood that day, or whether or not your paperwork made it, how those rules can change. And the feelings that you might feel in a situation like this. The feelings that you might feel in a situation like this. From the chaplain's perspective, inmates in this environment experiencing these experiences are going to feel certain negative emotions, and these negative emotions are exacerbated by that environment. Chaplains call prison breeding grounds for negative emotions. And when we ask inmates, they'll say pretty much the same thing. So hopefully this will work. Here we go. Okay. Okay, here we go.
Every time we step into another prison, we're amazed by the world that we enter. It's violent, it's loud, very intimidating, and yet through it all, it's a fascinating place. But the daily grind of prison life has been known to push some inmates to the brink. The agony, what it is here, the torture, the hope, the drawn, the constant, frustration, and you never, you feel like you can't release. How do people release their frustration? You build your body, you build your muscle. You swing it, you tattoo, you do all that stuff. Some use the time wisely. Yeah, man. Get that money. Get that money, man. But other inmates self-destruct. I'll take a razor blade and cut myself up real bad. And then it'll all be all right. Prisons are hate factories. They can't produce anything but hate.
Okay, so hopefully in that very brief clip, you can see some of what the chaplains are worried are being bred here. This feeling that negative emotions are somehow being bred in this miasma, and so chaplains' perception that they're breeding grounds of these negative emotions draws on two other kinds of ideas about emotions, and the first is engulfing emotions. Sometimes we experience our emotions in a way that is so overwhelming to us, we feel like we're out of control. The emotion is, we are not in control of our emotion. The emotion is actually controlling us because we've been overwhelmed and we are now engulfed by our anger, by our fear, by our depression, by our sadness. And inmates, from the chaplain's perspective, are seen as extremely susceptible to being engulfed by their emotions. They're seen as being very emotionally volatile, they're very unpredictable, they're very capricious, and in fact, chaplains will say this is often what led them to be incarcerated or imprisoned, was the fact that they could not control themselves. They could not control their emotions, and specifically their negative emotions. And we tend to view people who don't control their emotions, who are very emotionally volatile, in a negative fashion. We see them as dangerous and irrational and unpredictable. So there's this very strong norm about controlling your expression of emotion when you're in public. Okay? So if I was really, really sad right now, really, really upset, the rule is I don't break down and cry because I'm in public, that I have an audience, that is not appropriate. That's the rule. And chaplains believe that, well, in prison, this rule is particularly strong. It's doubly strong. The rule is when you're in prison, you need to control your emotional expression no matter what you're feeling. Okay? And so according to chaplains, they'll say things like, we're in an environment where emotions are not allowed. People just don't let them out. And that makes the campus cold and sterile. And this is particularly true for feelings of sadness and depression, irritation, frustration, that this rule is don't let other people see this. Don't let other people see this. And I'm sure you probably can assume the reason why. But for chaplains, if you feel sad, or if an inmate feels sad, and they demonstrate that to other people, their thinking is that inmates see it as a weakness. You are weak. And if you are in prison, you're swimming with the sharks. So you can't be seen as weak. They smell blood and they attack. So if you demonstrate that you are weak by showing your emotions, if you cry, or you get upset, or you say, my mom just died, I'm having a bad day, back off, that will invite other people, other inmates, to take advantage of you. So the norm about controlling your emotion in prison, from a chaplain's perspective, has everything to do with being seen as weak. So, to quote, from an inmate's point of view, you never want to be perceived as weak. Sharing emotion gives that perception. You're a weak individual, and if you're weak, someone's going to try and take advantage of you. So there's a fear. There's a fear in doing that. And that fear causes inmates to, quote unquote, stuff their emotions, to stuff down and control their emotions. Because when you and I feel very sad, we can go home and we can curl up in our bed and we can cry our eyeballs out because we have a place where it's private, where it's not public. But in prison, one of those pains of imprisonment is a loss of privacy. You're being watched all the time, 24 hours, 7 days a week, 24/7, by other inmates and by correctional officers. There is no place for you to go and privately manage your emotions. So instead, chaplains believe that inmates stuff down their emotions. They tamp it down, okay? They're unable to distance themselves from the eyeballs of other people, so instead, when they feel sad, they just push it down and they deny it. You gotta pretend that you're calm, cool, and collected. You can't exhibit your sadness, not at all, because that is weakness. But the problem is, the very, very big problem from a chaplain's perspective is that there's only so much emotion that any one person can handle. And if you stuff that down over and over and over again, you're causing pressure within the individual to increase, and at some point, it's all going to come out. So stuffing down your emotions is only temporary. It's not a permanent solution. So they'll say, if you don't let it out, if you don't let out your emotion, it will eat you alive. It will destroy you from the inside out, according to chaplains. And significantly, it's not like this emotion's just oozing out like slime, like here's a little bit, here's a little bit, here's a little bit. No, it doesn't come out that way. Instead, they come exploding out in a very destructive way. And we're talking about anger, we're talking about sadness, what we consider to be negative emotions, coming out like a bomb, okay? They call this, this accumulated pressure, kind of a powder keg of emotion, and it's only going to take a little tiny spark to make that powder keg explode. So one chaplain says, one inmate will explode like a gas stove turned on too high. They hide their emotion until it's at that breaking point, and that's the last straw that breaks the camel's back, because they don't let it out. They don't have a way to let out that emotion. They just let it accumulate, accumulate, accumulate until they explode. And so chaplains see inmates, and they use this metaphor as emotional bombs. Okay? They're stuffing down their emotions, and here they are walking around like these little bombs. Tick, 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 tick. And of course, this is going to increase the miasma of the prison, because you're never sure who is going to explode, what might set them off, and what the consequence might be. They're just walking around, tick, 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 tick. And the potential damage that might occur as a result of one of these inmates exploding, they'll encounter some sort of threat, some sort of little trigger, and boom, they'll explode, just like a little grenade. Okay? And you never know what that little perceived insult or that perceived threat might be. So in 1971, we had the Attica prison riot, and of course, there's many, many contributing factors to this riot. It was probably one of the most well-known prison riots, obviously in New York State, in which 39 hostages and inmates were killed, one of the bloodiest, and huge, right? Lots and lots of contributing factors, creating this tension and this emotion, just building and building and building and building and building. And then what was the little tiny spark that set that off? It was toilet paper. The lack of toilet paper was what set off this huge chain of events leading to a standoff with the state police in which the state troopers storm in, 39 people die, and it's all over toilet paper. So according to Chaplains, you have these inmates who are emotionally volatile, who are stuffing down their emotions and stuffing and stuffing and stuffing and stuffing, and along comes a little spark and poof, they all explode. Okay? They all explode. And of course, the negative repercussions of this are safety and security go out the window, multiple people might be harmed, inmates and staff, because there's like shrapnel, right? You never know who might be harmed. You never know who might be harmed. It can range from arguments to lethal violence. And of course, this is exacerbated by two factors. The first of which are homemade weapons. Can't talk about prison without talking about homemade weapons. So this table right here are all the weapons that were confiscated after the Attica prison riot. Other prisons, the facilities will have cases that clearly demonstrate some of the potential ways that you could be killed in prison. You have silverware, you have spoons, you'll have writing utensils. Most often they're going to be some sort of knife-like object, but you'll also have garrotes where you're tying something around somebody's neck. And so there's lots and lots of ways that weapons, inmates are extremely creative when making up their weapons. They'll hide them around the prison because then if it's found, you can claim that you don't own it, but you know where it is in case you need it. So of course the situation is going to be exacerbated by the fact that hundreds, if not thousands, of these types of objects are hidden around the facility. The second exacerbating factor, according to Chaplains, have to do with our current incarceration trends. We incarcerate more adults in the United States than any other country. Currently, and this is mid-year 2009, according to the Bureau of Justice, 1 in 100 adults were in prison, and that's gone up since 2009. And of course, that'll depend on what groups we're talking about. But generally speaking, we incarcerate many, many fellow adult Americans. And leaving aside the problem of how do we pay for all these people, how do we pay for the astronomical cost of incarceration, the real significant issue here today is overcrowding. Where do we put all of these people? These facilities are designed for a certain amount of number of inmates, but now we're being asked to convert gym spaces, cafeteria spaces into living quarters because we don't know where to put them. In Arizona, we put them under tents outside, and in some cases, we triple bunk them. And according to Chaplains, obviously, this is going to affect the emotional component because you're going to be breeding frustration. You're going to increase the possibility of arguments leading to lethal violence when you have people who are suffering and trying to cope with a very difficult situation right on top of one another. Literally, right on top of one another. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And this is not just in California, which many of us might consider to be the number one. This is happening in all states. All states. So chaplains are seeing this setting as on the brink of boiling over. It's like a pot that's been left on the stove for too long because all of these inmates are stuffing down their emotions. There are all these emotional bombs just ticking and waiting to explode. And then we pile them all together in this confined area. And then they have these homemade weapons. And wow, this situation is bad. Situation is bad. And so what is the result? Well, according to Chaplains, this is what we can expect to happen.
When another inmate
the feeling of what it might be like and what chaplains are worried about. And even in that clip, you can hear the correctional officer saying they're out of control, the issue of being emotionally volatile, of course. So then, if this is what's happening, how do chaplains help? Because they perceive that this setting is going to explode. Correctional officers, well, they're there to maintain, but they're not really dealing with the emotional component, which chaplains see as vital to contributing to situations of hostile violence, of riots, and these types of events. So how can the chaplain help? Well, first, chaplains as employees see themselves as safety and security oriented. They feel it's partially or fully their responsibility to go around, make sure that emotion is being ventilated a little at a time, dissipate any of the accumulated pressure that has built up, and prevent it from accumulating in the future. So chaplains really see themselves as a safety valve when it comes to emotions, working inmate by inmate, to let a little bit of that steam and a little bit of that pressure out, little by little. And they do this in three ways. They try to isolate, they try to purge, and then they try to restore, and it's somewhat of a process. So first, they want to isolate them because they're worried that, again, an inmate believes if somebody sees me cry, I am going to be a potential target. So the first very important thing is to isolate the inmate and to provide them with a safe place. And chaplains do this by taking them to their office, which they consider to be the only safe place in the prison where an inmate can express themselves. It's also significant and important to isolate because we want to make sure that the setting remains stable, or what they call keeping it mellow. We don't want this person's emotion to contribute to somebody else becoming emotional and a chain reaction. So first we want to isolate them. The second thing we want to do is chaplains will try to purge out all of the pent-up emotion, kind of like a wound that has been festering. They're going to try and get all of that badness out because it's just been sitting in there and festering, and it's accumulating pressure. So they want to let it out. And at this time, during the purge, chaplains are expecting inmates to perform their emotions. They are expecting them to sob and to cry and to shout and to curse. They want to see the emotion. Okay? They better see it. Inmates better demonstrate it because we're talking about inmates, and the expectation is inmates are not like the rest of us. They manipulate you. They will use whatever they can to get what they want, including emotions. So I'm going to cry so that you feel bad for me and give me what I want. Okay? So chaplains expect for these inmates to perform their emotion in a way that shows, I'm not faking it. I want to see you cry. I want to see you weep. I want to see snot running down your face. I really want to see that you're authentic. Okay? So when they're purging all of these emotions out, it is important to the chaplain that the inmate demonstrates, I am the real thing. I want to get better. I want to be treated. I want to be rehabilitated. Last but not least, they want to talk about restoring the inmate, because once we've purged you of all these bad emotions, you're at the rock bottom. Now we got to build you back up. And when we build the inmate back up, chaplains are strategically utilizing other people to get the inmate to feel empathy for the community. So I'm going to use your family, I'm going to use your friends, I'm going to use the victims. I want you to understand what your actions do to that person and what your emotional expression, how that will affect them. So I don't want you to think about your emotions and just you. I want you to think about how would your emotion affect me, how would it affect these people, how would it affect the people outside of Alfred, so that we are encouraging feelings of empathy. And this is significant because we are expecting, number one, if I do this, if I can encourage you to feel connection to other people in the community before you express your anger, number one, in the prison setting, well, we're hoping that will decrease the number of violent altercations, riot, and other critical incidents. So in the prison setting, hopefully that will stabilize that. And secondly, most of them are going to get out. They're going to come back to the community. So we're hoping if I can encourage you to have an empathy or an empathetic connection to somebody else, you won't go out, commit another wrongdoing that might harm somebody else because you're thinking about what does it mean for these other people, trying to curb reoffenses in the community. Okay? So in this way, chaplains are utilizing emotions as social control. Yes, certainly, they are hoping to treat and rehabilitate and help restore offenders to whole people. They want to help them. They want to help their hearts heal. They want them to feel better and to cope effectively with the pains of imprisonment. That's their job as treatment staff. But at the same time, by encouraging inmates to think in terms of other people, they are also using a more custodial orientation, which the correctional officers take on. Chaplains are hoping to control the behavior of inmates through their emotions. Through their emotions. So in this way, looking at emotions, looking at prison chaplains, we're seeing a very curious hybrid between treatment and custody that actually I would argue we'll see in other staff, but in particular with prison chaplains who have seen their role change and evolve so much since the beginning of their tenure in the prison population. And so I think that this is a very good place for me to stop and say thank you, and I'm going to end here and ask what questions that you have. So thank you very much.